All righty. Baruch atah Adonai le'olam, shehakol nidbarei. Chaim v'chaim v'bracha. Okay, continuing the Maimer. So the idea that there's a klal uprat, a general principle, a general idea, and then the detail, right? And as we explained, the detail comes from the general principle or general idea, as in a teacher. As in a teacher. So what we introduce now is a fascinating idea that through the detail, you actually come to even higher, something higher than where it came from. How's that work? Right? How's that work that by dealing with the detail that comes from a general principle or general idea, and it's in the general principle and idea there, just in a hidden manner. Now that when you focus in on the detail, you're going to come to a greater place. And this is in other words, God in his creation, as we explain, that there's the encompassing light of God that is the general, is the klal, the general energy, if you will, of creation, the general light of creation. And then that comes into being actualized through the specifics of creations, the detail of creation, right? That God animates his cup differently, uniquely, l'chaim.
L'chaim.
And then he does this mouse, right? Where does that all come from? From the general light of God that is animating, that's beyond the world. Yet, through our avodah, through our divine service, in the detail and the finer details, we reach to the essence of light, not beyond the detail, of course, beyond even though the source of that detail, which that source of the detail is the general light and energy of divinity that creates the world, right? That's beyond the world. You reach there. Ooh. To the etzem ha'or, the essence of the word. So how do we understand this? As God gives us a capability. How do we fathom the idea? That's where we're going now. So the Indian is as follows. This is interesting. Now, even though we speak about the specifics, the detail come from the general principle, the general light, the general divine energy that is animating the world, right? The specific, right? As in other words, Bereshis is the general encompassing word of God that it creates all of the world. And then it comes into the specifics. Let there be light. Let the earth sprout forth grass, herbs, trees, and so on, right? Yet, the detail in it, in its root source, is greater than the general principle, comes from a higher place. So this is where we're going now. Like we see by Chachma and Bina. Chachma, the power of what? Nullity. Bina, the power to build on an idea, right? The idea, the seed of, the general principle, right? Chachma is the seed, the general principle of an idea. Bina is the details, the breadth, the length, and the depth of an idea. That's specifications, all the details. Where does it come from? Where is it teased out from? When we speak about the intellectual process, from Chachma, the seed of an idea, right? So again, Chachma is the general principle that from it is drawn all the details of Bina. Nonetheless, this itself, the root source of Bina, is actually greater than Chachma. Oh, okay. And empirically, we can understand and appreciate this idea. Why? Because through the going into the minutia of the details of Bina, the length, the breadth, the depth of an idea, right, of a teachings, whatever it is, right? You are actually sometimes adding new ideas that were not originally in the quintessential point of Chachma. Ooh, think about it. We've all experienced this, right? We've all experienced that when you kind of hone in on the finer detail of an idea, that all of a sudden that finer detail gives rise to new ideas that weren't there before. How could it give rise to something more? If the detail only came from the general principle, how could it be? Because the power of Bina, right, which is taking apart an idea, building on, right, building on the idea. You're, on one hand, Bina is only taking that which you have from Chokhmah and building on it. On the other hand, it doesn't always have to be that way, but it has the capability, the possibility of adding things, because when you go to the deep dive into the details, new ideas come up that were not there originally, even in the Chokhmah, the seed of knowledge. Now, you know where we can really appreciate this idea is in the distinction between thought and speech. as the Rebbe says, in a similar way, right? When you think something through, oh, but first of all, where's your speech come from? It comes from your thoughts, right? Your thoughts come from your feelings, right? Your feelings come from your mind, the perspective of the mind. Okay, so um, right, that's a general principle. Yet there's something about the power of speech. When you have a problem in life, it's good to think it through. But you know what's even better? Talk it through. Why? First of all, when you think an idea or thought or something, all right, just to let you know, all people who just come here with an agenda, I block them, I remove them. So, it's just not going to help, you know. Yeah, a lot of, anyway, doesn't matter. So, you have a thought. For you to speak it out takes a long time. One simple thought can take sentences, paragraphs, or even a long time to elaborate upon it, right? That's the idea of the general and the specific. The thought is like the general, right? That is like the seed that now when you bring it into speech, it becomes elongated, right? Similar to the Chochmah and Bina, right? Is thought and speech. Not to confuse the two, by the way. So the the so even though the speech is coming from the thought, right? Yet speech has in its root source is greater than the thought and even greater than bina, right? Which is the power of understanding of the mind, of the brain. It even is higher than that. Therefore, we see that when you learn an idea, right, an intellectual idea, that when you actually speak it out, new thoughts or new ideas rather, I shouldn't new thoughts because you're speaking it, so it's not a thought, even though you've got to think it to speak it, or it's got to be in some form there, right? But there's new understanding that wasn't there before, which is unbelievable. How is that possible? How is it that when you speak out something, it happens to you, right? When you have an issue and you speak it out with a person to help you through it. Now, it's not just the fact that there's another person who may be giving more perspective, but even if they don't, how many times does it happen? We've all experienced it, that you had an issue and you spoke it out and you just spoke it out. The other person was just a sounding board, didn't even say anything or anything, add anything. But, their support, I guess, is always welcome. But by you speaking it out, all of a sudden you have clarity. New ideas came to the fore that weren't there in your thoughts. But you thought it through yourself. How come you didn't come up with it in your thoughts? Well, because then you were stupid. Now you're smart. No, no. It's because the power of speech is such that it has the power. It doesn't mean it always will be this way, right? Um, has the power of reaching to a greater place than your thoughts, even though thoughts were the source of your speech. But in its root source, right? Because speech is, in the end, speech is not um, you know, speech emerges from thought, but speech is its own power. It's its own thing, right? It isn't merely an offshoot of thought, and thought is not merely an offshoot of emotions. No, they're all independent entities. So even though they emerge from somewhere, but they are not as a result of that thing. That's not what is their being, if you will, or their, right? So therefore, speech has the power to reveal something that was not in thought, a new idea that adds. And how often does it? Again, from experience, we see that. What is the point over here? And as we see, our sages say that the master teacher, who does he gain most from? Himself, you would think, because he's the master teacher. So him involved in his thoughts, his teachings, you know, a student that he's eons beyond this master teacher, like our Rebbe, right? What's the student going to give? Except no, our sages say the opposite. That where does the master teacher learn most from? Not his equals, not from himself, not from equals, but from his students. He learns most from. Why? Because in the act of teaching, of giving it over, there's, and the questions that come from the teacher, right, develops new ideas that were hitherto not there in the original thought even. That's the metaphor. That's amazing. Now, that was all a metaphor for us to appreciate the analog. And that will be shared tomorrow. The powerful message of what that means and how we actually add something to the divine order of things, which is unbelievable. That is greater than what God does in his act of creation.
That's why, Rabbi, when we learn something, we should talk about it with someone.
Yes, you share it.
You share it.
So one thing, I mean, there's many, yes, there's many reasons for that. The simplest reason and the most relevant is not because you're going to come with greater wisdom, but you remember at least. If you don't talk it with someone, then you're not going to remember what we learned just now, right? You're going to keep it in your head, but you do talk it out, right? So you're going to remember, but that doesn't mean you added something, right? Not necessarily you will add anything. It's not always through talking it out that you add something, right? It has the capability, has the power to, right? So when you really talk it through in its finer details, that's when you're really going to add something. In others, there's a real engagement and effort put into it, right? Otherwise, if you just talk it over and just remember, but that itself is amazing, right? And you're going to remember it also is interesting. You'll remember it much more quickly that when you do talk it out with someone else, as opposed to you just think it through yourself, right? Yeah. But here we're going into even much more, not that you'll just maintain what you learn, but you're going to add something. That's a novelty that we didn't think, right? Because what you just said, you weren't adding anything. You're just saying this way you remember, because that's normal. But to add to it, that's where we're going with this. That's the whole point. Through talking it out, you add something that wasn't originally there in your thoughts when you thought it through. That's much more, powerful. And that's what we do, right, in our divine service. That's the uniqueness where we're going. Is that clear? Clear idea?
Yes, very good.
But we'll have to wait for that.